Welcome, everyone. Today we're going to explore something fundamental to success, resilience, and mental health, and that is the ability to take action, especially when you don't feel like it. Now, from a neuroscience perspective, this isn't just about pushing through or toughing it out. This is about understanding how the brain works under resistance, how our neurochemistry, our prefrontal cortex, and even our dopamine systems are involved in the choices we make every single day. There's a myth that motivation must precede action, but what research actually shows and what countless high performers experience is that action itself creates motivation. That's right, when you move, when you begin, when you take that first uncomfortable step, the brain responds by releasing neurochemicals that make sustained effort possible. Not easy, but possible. And this is a trainable skill. It's not something reserved for the elite or genetically gifted. You can wire your nervous system to show up with discipline, even when the emotional part of your brain, the limbic system, is screaming for comfort, distraction, or delay. You can build a system that teaches your brain, we don't wait to feel like it. We go anyway. So today, let's break down what it really takes to force yourself to work when every fiber of your being is resisting, and more importantly, how you can condition your mind and body to make that choice not just once, but consistently for a lifetime. Many people believe that motivation is the spark that leads to action, that they need to feel inspired, energized, or emotionally ready before they can begin doing hard things. But neuroscience tells us something different. Motivation is not the starting point, it's a byproduct. The action itself, especially when initiated under resistance, is what triggers the release of chemicals in the brain that generate motivation. In other words, you don't wait for motivation to act. You act, and then motivation follows. This is where the concept of action precedes motivation becomes critical. The brain, particularly the dopaminergic system, responds dynamically to behavior. Dopamine, which is often misunderstood as the pleasure chemical, is more accurately described as a molecule of motivation and pursuit. It drives effort and goal-directed behavior. When you begin a task, even reluctantly, your brain starts to release dopamine, not because you're feeling good, but because it anticipates forward movement, accomplishment, and potential reward. The initiation of effort sends a signal that says something valuable might be coming, and the brain responds by energizing you to keep going. There's a structure in the brain called the anterior midcingulate cortex that is strongly associated with persistence, especially when tasks are effortful or uncomfortable. When you engage in challenging work, even when you don't feel like it, this area activates, increasing your capacity to endure and adapt. Over time, repeated engagement under resistance conditions builds stronger neural pathways that make initiating action less effortful in the future. Essentially, by repeatedly choosing to act without waiting for motivation, you are reprogramming your brain to make action the default response. The prefrontal cortex, which governs planning, impulse control, and decision-making, also plays a vital role here. This region of the brain can override limbic, emotionally driven signals that scream for rest, procrastination, or escape. When you feel like avoiding work and yet choose to begin anyway, you are strengthening the executive control centers of the brain. You are giving yourself a powerful neurobiological advantage, not by hoping for inspiration, but by initiating behavior despite its absence. This is why routines and systems are so important. They eliminate the need to make emotional decisions about effort. When behavior becomes procedural and embedded into a schedule, it no longer depends on whether you feel like doing it. The brain learns to associate certain times, environments, or cues with immediate action, regardless of internal resistance. And every time you follow through, even when you're tired or overwhelmed, you get a small dopamine reward that reinforces that behavior. One way to leverage this is through what psychologists call behavioral activation. This involves taking deliberate, goal-directed action even in the absence of motivation, and it's one of the most effective treatments for conditions like depression and burnout. The brain learns from what you do, not from what you intend to do. Each time you sit down and open the laptop, pick up the tool, or start the task, you teach your nervous system that you're the kind of person who moves forward, regardless of mood or energy level. This shapes your identity, and over time, identity becomes the engine of consistent action. Also crucial to this process is the idea of friction, the resistance you feel before starting. Many people interpret that friction as a stop signal. I don't feel like doing this, so maybe I shouldn't. But in fact, that friction is a sign that you're entering a state where growth can occur. If you can recognize it as part of the process, not a problem, but a threshold, you can start to reframe effort as something desirable. Neuroplasticity, or the brain's ability to rewire itself, is most active under conditions of focused attention and challenge. The more you engage in action under stress or resistance, the more your brain adapts to make that process smoother and more automatic. It also helps to keep in mind that the first few minutes are often the hardest. Once you've begun, your physiology starts to change. Your heart rate increases, your body releases norepinephrine, and you become more alert and focused. This shift helps engage the task-positive network of the brain, which supports sustained concentration. Once this network is activated, distractions and avoidance impulses lose some of their power. In short, starting creates a cascade of changes in your mind and body that allow you to keep going, and these changes can't happen until you act. We also have to address the myth that only some people are naturally disciplined or high-performing. While individual differences exist, what often separates high performers from others is their willingness to act in the absence of motivation. They have trained themselves through repetition and structure to take that first step no matter how they feel. This is not a matter of grit born from genetics. It's a skill, and like all skills, it gets stronger the more you use it. The discomfort at the start doesn't go away completely, but your response to it changes. You begin to expect it, and more importantly, you stop needing it to be absent in order to proceed. Discomfort is not the enemy. In fact, it is one of the most powerful signals your brain can give you. When you experience mental or physical resistance to a task, your nervous system is telling you that you are at the edge of your current capability. This edge, where challenge meets hesitation, is the ideal condition for growth, both neurologically and psychologically. When you force yourself to work through discomfort, you're not just getting something done, you're actively training your brain to become more resilient, more adaptable, and more capable over time. In the field of neuroscience, discomfort is not seen as something to be avoided, but as an entry point into neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity refers to the brain's ability to change itself through experience and behavior. But plasticity does not occur under passive or relaxed states. It happens under conditions of strain, effort, and focus. When you confront a task that your mind wants to avoid and you persist anyway, you're placing your brain in a heightened state of readiness to learn and adapt. You're firing circuits that have not been used often or effectively, and in doing so, you are literally changing the wiring of your own brain. The amygdala, a brain region involved in fear and emotional processing, often becomes active when we anticipate discomfort. It sends warning signals encouraging you to back off, delay, or disengage, but when your prefrontal cortex overrides that alarm when you decide to act, despite the warning, you are teaching your brain that discomfort does not equal danger. Over time, this reconditioning process reduces the power of those emotional alarms. Tasks that once provoked dread begin to feel more manageable and, in some cases, even neutral. This is what real mental toughness looks like at a biological level. The ability to regulate your response to discomfort and to use it as a cue to engage rather than retreat. It is also important to understand that the sensation of discomfort is largely driven by what scientists call limbic friction. This refers to the internal battle between your limbic system, responsible for emotion and impulse, and your prefrontal cortex, which manages logic, planning, and control. Limbic friction feels like procrastination, anxiety, or resistance to starting, but it is not a permanent block. It is a temporary condition that can be overcome by acting in opposition to the emotional impulse. Each time you take a step forward while experiencing limbic friction, you're tipping the balance in favor of your executive brain. You're strengthening the very circuitry that makes self-discipline possible. There's also a fascinating loop that occurs between effort and reward. The brain is capable of learning to associate effort itself with reward, not just the outcome of effort. This is deeply tied to how dopamine functions. Most people think of dopamine as something you get after achieving something. But in fact, dopamine is released during the process of pursuing a goal, especially when the pursuit is effortful and meaningful. When you repeatedly confront discomfort and still take action, your brain begins to associate effort with reward. That means the very sensation of doing something difficult can start to feel satisfying, even if it's still hard. This shift is profound. It turns discomfort into a signal that you're on the right path rather than a sign to stop. Working through discomfort also increases your tolerance for future stress. Each experience of moving forward under strain adds to your stress inoculation. Like how physical exercise trains the body to handle greater loads, psychological discomfort trains the brain to handle more pressure. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel routine. The threshold for what your nervous system can handle increases, and so does your confidence. You start to recognize that emotions like fatigue, boredom, frustration, or even fear are not stop signs, they are simply part of the process. This is especially powerful when discomfort is predictable. If you know that starting a task will likely bring unease or resistance, you can prepare your brain to meet it. That preparation may involve breathwork, focused attention, or simply recognizing the emotion for what it is, a transient signal, not a permanent state. When discomfort becomes expected, it becomes manageable. And when it's manageable, it loses its power to control your behavior. The repetition of these moments, showing up when it's hard, pushing through when it's uncomfortable, creates a neural framework that is more resilient, more efficient, and more focused. These changes aren't temporary. With consistent action, they become permanent features of how your brain operates. Discomfort then becomes less of an obstacle and more of a functional training ground. You don't have to eliminate it. You have to learn to lean into it. The brain will respond accordingly. The circuits involved in attention, control, and goal-directed behavior will fire more easily. The stress response will become more measured. And over time, you will start to see discomfort not as a threat, but as an invitation to grow. Most people are taught to visualize success by imagining the end goal, the applause, the rewards, the feeling of accomplishment. While this type of visualization can generate excitement, it often falls short when it's time to actually do the work. The neuroscience of performance and motivation suggests a far more effective method: visualizing the effort. When you mentally rehearse not just the outcome, but the actual work, the grind, the repetition, the obstacles, you train your brain to be more prepared, less reactive, and more resilient in the face of difficulty. This approach builds real grit because it conditions your nervous system to expect challenge and engage with it rather than retreat from it. The brain doesn't distinguish much between what is vividly imagined and what is experienced. This is why elite athletes, military operators, and high performers across domains use what's called functional imagery training. Instead of just picturing themselves crossing the finish line, they mentally simulate the burning in their muscles, the moments they want to quit, the sound of distractions, the physical fatigue, and then visualize themselves responding with composure and focus. This is more than positive thinking. It's a neurological preparation for stress and effort. The result is greater confidence, better emotional regulation, and a stronger tendency to persist through resistance. This kind of mental rehearsal recruits the same neural circuits that will be engaged during actual performance. The premotor cortex, supplementary motor area, and cerebellum all activate during effort-based visualization. These regions help organize complex movement, sustain attention, and manage timing. But perhaps more importantly, visualizing effort activates the anterior cingulate cortex, a region involved in conflict monitoring and error detection. By simulating difficult situations in advance, you're literally training your brain to stay online and composed during real stress. It's like having a map of the terrain before you set out into the storm. There's also a psychological shift that occurs when you focus on effort rather than reward. You begin to see the process as the point. Rather than being attached to the outcome, you develop an intrinsic connection to the challenge itself. This mindset, what researchers call process orientation, is one of the most consistent predictors of long-term success. It leads to greater perseverance, better learning, and reduced anxiety. Why? Because you're no longer depending on a distant, fragile reward to justify your actions. You've already trained yourself to embrace the friction, to find value in the doing rather than just the result. Another benefit of effort visualization is emotional buffering. When you imagine the difficulties ahead, when you anticipate boredom, fear, frustration, or fatigue, you begin to inoculate yourself against those emotions. You won't be caught off guard when they arrive because your brain has already experienced and processed them in a controlled way. This reduces the shock and intensity of negative emotion in real time. You feel more capable of handling it because, in a very real sense, you already have. This is how visualization strengthens resilience. It gives you rehearsal time for discomfort, so your brain is less likely to interpret it as a threat and more likely to stay calm and focused. When you mentally walk through the effort phase of a task, you also engage your default mode network, an internal system involved in introspection, future planning, and sense-making. This network helps you place effort into a narrative. You begin to connect today's grind with tomorrow's character. You begin to see yourself not just as someone who does hard things, but as someone who is built to do hard things. This identity shift is powerful. Motivation based on identity is far more sustainable than motivation based on temporary emotion or surface-level goals. It's worth noting that for visualization to be effective, it must be specific, sensory-rich, and grounded in reality. Vague affirmations or wishful thinking don't activate the brain's performance systems. But when you visualize the texture of the work, the cold floor in the early morning, the flicker of distractions on your screen, the tension in your shoulders, the long silence before an idea comes, your brain begins to internalize that as normal. It no longer feels foreign or alarming. It feels expected. That familiarity reduces hesitation and creates a smoother transition from thought to action. Repeated visualization of effort also increases your sense of control. One of the most stressful aspects of any challenge is unpredictability. But if your brain has already walked through the process, even just mentally, it reduces the feeling of being overwhelmed. It becomes easier to break tasks into parts to engage the work rhythmically rather than reactively. This enhances your executive functioning, your ability to plan, inhibit distraction, and adjust behavior in real time. By visualizing the work itself, the friction in the middle, you teach your brain to stop resisting effort and start accepting it as part of the path. You stop seeing work as something to be endured and start seeing it as something to be embodied. One of the simplest yet most neurologically powerful tools for overcoming resistance is what's often called the 5-minute rule. The idea is to commit to doing a task for just 5 minutes, even if you don't feel like it. This isn't a motivational gimmick. It's based on how the brain transitions from inaction to momentum. When you're resisting work, it's not usually because the task is too hard, it's because of the mental weight of starting. The limbic system, which governs emotional responses, flares up with avoidance signals when a task feels overwhelming or uncomfortable. But the prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making and executive function, can override those signals through brief, structured action. The 5-minute window becomes a neurological wedge, a way to bypass the emotional resistance and initiate movement before the brain has a chance to talk you out of it. The first few minutes of effort are often the hardest, not because the work is particularly grueling, but because your nervous system is shifting states. It's moving from rest and comfort into stress and focus. That shift involves a cascade of changes in neurochemistry, particularly the increase of norepinephrine and acetylcholine, which support alertness, attention, and sensory tuning. By committing to just 5 minutes, you're allowing these chemicals to start flowing. Once they do, your cognitive system becomes more engaged, distractions lose their pull, and your mind becomes more anchored in the present task. What started as friction becomes flow, not because the external task changed, but because your internal state did. This is where the concept of limbic friction becomes highly relevant. Limbic friction is the resistance you feel when your emotional brain wants comfort, but your rational brain knows that effort is required. The 5-minute rule is a mechanism for reducing that friction. You're not forcing yourself to complete a large task all at once. You're simply tricking your brain into bypassing the emotional block that prevents starting. And the moment you begin, you send a message to your brain that you're in motion, and the brain responds accordingly. Action reduces doubt faster than any amount of positive thinking. There's also a strong psychological component to this technique. By starting small, you give yourself a win. That win might seem minor, but it produces a measurable shift in your internal reward system. Dopamine is not only released upon achieving big goals, it's also released during small steps that signal progress. When you begin a task and realize that you can handle the initial discomfort, dopamine begins to rise, reinforcing the behavior. That positive feedback loop encourages you to keep going. The 5 minutes often stretch into 10, then 20, then an entire work session, not because you forced yourself to grind, but because you eased your nervous system into a more productive state. This method also enhances the brain's capacity for attentional focus. When you begin a task and limit your commitment to 5 minutes, you are naturally reducing cognitive load. You don't need to map out the entire process or anticipate every challenge. You just need to start. This reduction in perceived demand makes it easier for the brain to allocate attention to the present moment. Once attention is engaged, the default mode network, often responsible for daydreaming and distraction, goes offline, and the task-positive network takes over. This is the network responsible for goal-oriented behavior and sustained effort. Activating it is often a matter of simply getting started, and the 5-minute rule offers the entry point. There's also a behavioral conditioning element involved. When you repeatedly initiate tasks under low motivation using a fixed-time strategy, your brain begins to expect and accept that effort will follow a trigger. Over time, the resistance associated with that trigger diminishes. The desk no longer signals dread, the book no longer signals boredom, the workout gear no longer signals exhaustion. Instead, these cues begin to activate preparation responses. Your nervous system starts preparing for effort because you've trained it to expect effort at that moment. This is a form of stimulus-response pairing that creates automaticity over time. The result is a smoother transition from intention to action with less psychological pushback. The 5-minute rule also capitalizes on the brain's tendency to maintain inertia. The law of inertia, objects in motion tend to stay in motion, applies to human behavior as well. Once you're working, it often takes less effort to keep going than it did to start. This is because the neurochemical environment of action sustains itself through feedback loops. Effort produces focus, focus reduces distraction, progress increases dopamine, and dopamine motivates continued effort. All of this is initiated not by willpower alone, but by structured minimal commitment. You are lowering the entry barrier just enough to get the machine running, and once it runs, it sustains itself for longer than you initially thought possible. Understanding this technique on a neurobiological level empowers you to use it strategically. You're not depending on motivation or hoping for a mood shift. You're using what neuroscience knows about state change, inertia, and reward systems to build a habit of action. You are deliberately changing your internal environment by changing your external behavior, which is ultimately how lasting change is created. The decision to begin for 5 minutes becomes a training ground for greater discipline, not by crushing resistance, but by slipping under it with precision and structure. The environment you place yourself in has a profound impact on your ability to initiate and sustain effort, especially when motivation is low. This isn't just a matter of preference or productivity style, it's rooted in how the brain processes cues, habits, and contextual associations. Your surroundings constantly communicate signals to your nervous system, many of which operate below conscious awareness. When you design your environment to minimize friction and amplify focus, you are shaping the neurological path of least resistance. The goal is not just to remove distractions, but to deliberately construct a space that triggers effort, reinforces intention, and supports consistent behavior even when emotional energy is low. The brain is incredibly responsive to cues. Sensory input like light, temperature, sound, and even the layout of objects can either signal safety and readiness or induce avoidance and rest. A cluttered, disorganized environment increases cognitive load, pulling attention away from the task at hand and making the initiation of work feel more effortful. In contrast, a structured, orderly space reduces unnecessary decision-making and primes your brain for a focused state. This isn't about aesthetics, it's about how the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex process familiar versus chaotic inputs. When your environment sends clear, consistent signals, the brain enters task mode more readily because it doesn't have to waste energy resolving ambiguity. One of the most effective ways to engineer your environment is through strategic friction. This means making unwanted behaviors harder and desired behaviors easier. If checking your phone breaks your concentration, physically placing it in another room increases the energy cost of that distraction. If sitting down to work feels overwhelming, preloading your workspace with only the essential tools needed for one task removes the inertia of setup. This approach is rooted in behavioral economics and neuroscience. When the immediate path is simplified, the likelihood of action increases. Your brain will often default to the option that requires the least cognitive resistance, so designing your space to make effort the easier option is a powerful form of self-direction. Another key element is environmental consistency. The brain creates strong associations between physical spaces and psychological states. If your desk has been a place of procrastination, the association between that space and avoidance behavior becomes encoded over time. To change this, you need to recondition the space by repeatedly performing focused, effortful work in it. This creates new neural associations. It teaches your brain that this is where work happens. Even something as subtle as the posture you adopt in that environment can reinforce the behavioral pattern. Sitting upright, engaging your visual field forward, and minimizing passive inputs like scrolling all reinforce an active, goal-oriented state. These physical and sensory cues trigger internal readiness through the engagement of brainstem circuits linked to alertness and forward movement. Lighting also plays a surprisingly critical role. Bright overhead lighting, particularly with blue spectrum content, stimulates the suprachiasmatic nucleus and helps align your circadian rhythm to a state of wakefulness. This promotes cortisol release in the morning, which is essential for focus and energy. In contrast, dim lighting or warm-toned ambient lighting signals restfulness and relaxation. If your workspace mimics the lighting of a sleep or leisure zone, your brain will be more inclined toward passive behavior. Adjusting lighting to match the neurochemical state you want to cultivate is a simple but potent intervention. Soundscapes matter too. Certain types of sound, particularly non-lyrical, repetitive, and low-frequency tones, can help entrain the brain into a focused rhythm. This is due to a phenomenon called brainwave entrainment, where external rhythmic stimuli synchronize internal neural oscillations. When your auditory environment is structured for focus, it reduces the mental cost of maintaining attention. Conversely, erratic or emotionally charged noise fragments focus and increases cortisol, which undermines task persistence. Designing an auditory environment that promotes calm intensity is not a luxury, it's a tool to shape your mental state. Another overlooked aspect of environment is temporal structure, how time is arranged and signaled in your space. Physical timers, visible schedules, and countdown clocks provide a sense of urgency and containment. They activate the brain's goal tracking systems and create a closed loop around a task. When the brain perceives that a task has a clear start and finish, it is more willing to engage, even in low motivation states. Open-ended tasks, by contrast, create ambiguity, which increases procrastination. By embedding time cues in your environment, you reduce ambiguity and increase the sense of manageable effort. All of this points to a central truth: the brain doesn't operate in isolation. It is continuously shaped by the inputs, rhythms, and patterns of the environment it inhabits. When you take control of that environment visually, acoustically, spatially, you are influencing the neurochemical and behavioral systems that determine your ability to work. You are not waiting for the right mood or hoping for willpower to strike. You are deliberately setting up conditions that tilt the balance toward action. The space around you becomes part of your strategy, not just a backdrop for your day. And when the environment supports effort, effort becomes far easier to access regardless of how you feel in the moment. The ability to persist through discomfort is one of the most predictive traits of long-term achievement, and it is trainable through deliberate exposure to controlled difficulty. This is where the science of stress adaptation becomes relevant. When the body and brain encounter a challenge, they initiate a cascade of responses: hormonal, neurological, behavioral, designed to restore balance and maintain performance. In small, manageable doses, the stress builds resilience rather than breaks it. The key lies in strategically placing yourself in uncomfortable situations, not to overwhelm the system, but to teach it how to adapt and stabilize under pressure. Just like a muscle grows in response to mechanical tension, your capacity for effort grows when you repeatedly place yourself just beyond your comfort zone. Discomfort signals the activation of the sympathetic nervous system. Your heart rate increases, breathing changes, muscles tighten, and the brain begins scanning for threats. But the way you interpret these sensations determines whether they escalate or resolve. If you train yourself to stay with those sensations, whether it's mental fatigue, emotional boredom, or physical agitation, you teach your nervous system that discomfort is not danger. That shift rewires your relationship with effort. Instead of seeing difficulty as a reason to stop, you start seeing it as a cue to lean in, to stay present, and to access another layer of focus and control. This mental toughness is not about ignoring pain or pushing recklessly. It's about building a refined sensitivity to stress and managing it skillfully. The prefrontal cortex plays a major role in this process. It's the part of your brain that can override reflexive impulses from the emotional centers, like the amygdala. When discomfort arises and you choose not to react, but instead to observe and continue, you're strengthening the connectivity between these regions. This is known as top-down regulation. Over time, this regulatory loop becomes faster and more efficient, allowing you to stay on task even when internal resistance flares up. This ability to observe a craving for ease without acting on it is a defining feature of mental discipline. It's also the gateway to neuroplasticity, because the brain changes most when you operate at the edge of your current capabilities. One of the most effective ways to cultivate this ability is through exposure to small, controlled challenges that require effort without overwhelming your capacity. This can include cold exposure, timed writing sprints, fasting, or difficult conversations, all of which train your system to encounter resistance and maintain voluntary action. The brain releases norepinephrine during these challenges, which enhances alertness and mobilizes energy. At the same time, dopamine is released not after the task is completed, but during the task when forward progress is perceived. This means that persistence itself is chemically rewarding, but only if the brain is trained to recognize small wins along the way. These neurochemical feedback loops make grit sustainable not through force, but through gradually increasing familiarity with strain and the rewards it brings. You can also build discomfort tolerance through what's called deliberate cognitive load. This involves intentionally engaging with tasks that are mentally taxing or emotionally inconvenient. Whether it's learning something complex, pushing through creative frustration, or resisting distraction, these experiences tax the executive system. But by engaging repeatedly without escape, you build synaptic strength in the circuits responsible for focus, inhibition, and memory. The discomfort becomes a signal that the brain is doing exactly what it needs to grow. When this reframing becomes habitual, motivation becomes less important. You're no longer driven by fleeting emotional states, but by the identity of someone who endures and adapts. Another powerful tool is breathwork. The breath is the only physiological system that is both automatic and under conscious control. This makes it a bridge between the reactive and deliberate parts of the nervous system. When discomfort arises, slow, controlled breathing, especially emphasizing the exhale, activates the parasympathetic branch and reduces physiological arousal. This creates space between sensation and response. It doesn't remove discomfort, but it prevents it from escalating into panic or avoidance. Over time, this builds a meta-awareness of stress, allowing you to remain in difficult conditions with greater calm and clarity. A helpful framework to understand this process is Hormes's the idea that small doses of stress stimulate growth. Just like lifting weights creates micro-tears in muscle fibers that lead to increased strength, applying stress to the nervous system in controlled doses builds durability. But if the load is too great or recovery is neglected, the system breaks down. So, building discomfort tolerance is not about going to extremes. It's about precision, pushing just far enough to stimulate adaptation, then repeating the process with consistency. This is what builds robustness over time. The more often you place yourself in these controlled discomfort zones, the more fluent your nervous system becomes in navigating them. Your baseline level of what feels hard begins to shift. Tasks that once felt draining become manageable. Situations that used to provoke anxiety become routine. This is the gradual hardening of the mind, not into rigidity, but into flexible, focused resilience. You're not training yourself to feel less discomfort, you're training yourself to respond more skillfully to it. That distinction is crucial because high performance rarely feels good in the moment. It feels demanding, uncertain, and at times deeply inconvenient. But for those who've conditioned their nervous systems to operate under those conditions, effort becomes less of a battle and more of a rhythm.